Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of our lesson on the Bloody Chamber. Please, before you watch this video, make sure that you have completed the written task from the last lesson. We're going to be looking at that in the second half of this video. Before we begin, I just want to say that I've been really gratified to see so many of you get involved, watching these YouTube videos, commenting on them, and it's been wonderful to read the written work you've produced as a result. Just like to clarify, these are of course learning resources. They're intended primarily for Year 12 students, but it's great if other people want to get involved and learn a bit about Angela Carter too. Inappropriate comments of course won't be tolerated. I will investigate them through YouTube and pursue them through the channels at school if necessary. All conversation on this channel should be academic, should be about Angela Carter, should be about the coursework that you are studying for, and as I say, keep all of those comments respectful, as you would in the real world. The title of your notes for today is The Fall of Man, and I'd like you just to pause and think, how does the Bloody Chamber short story link to, use ideas from, the Adam and Eve story from Genesis in the Bible? Pause and make a note of 3, 4, 5 ways that it uses that original story. Join me in having a look at this section from the second half of the short story. Jean-Yves, the piano tuner, is talking to the narrator, and he says, "You do not deserve this," referring of course to the torturous treatment the narrator is receiving from the Marquis. The narrator responds, "Who can say what I deserve or know?" I said. "I've done nothing but that may be sufficient reason for condemning me." "You disobeyed him," he said. "That is sufficient reason for him to punish you." "I only did what he knew I would, like Eve," he said. So here Carter is referring very specifically to the Adam and Eve narrative. She's referring to the original sin that Eve brought down on the heads of all human beings, so the Bible tells us, in that Garden of Eden. Eve, of course, took the fruit from the Tree of Knowledge, big act of curiosity there, but her curiosity, of course, transgressed the only rule that God had given to the humans in the garden. So curiosity, particularly female curiosity, leads to a recurring sin, a recurring curse, if you like, that plagues humankind forever after. Now, Carter is using this reference not to say she agrees with it. Obviously, she's using it to point out the logical fallacy behind the Adam and Eve narrative, the complete absurdity of the idea that one act of curiosity can condemn all human beings, as you remember in the biblical narrative, to awareness, shame, and ultimately death. In this context, is Carter's naming of Jean-Yves, that surname spelt in the French way but still phonetically reminding us of the name Eve, is that naming a sly reference maybe to the beta male's role in the downfall of humankind? He is quite feminine, therefore might also be culpable. Perhaps his curiosity, the thing that he's guilty of, is forming a relationship with the Marquis's wife. Maybe. We can only really speculate about these hidden meanings, but what we can be certain of is that Carter has used this biblical allusion to Adam and Eve to show that since the dawn of time, women's curiosity has led to their downfalls and also to the punishment of the human race in general. Remember that AO5 for this coursework in the mark scheme is criticality. You need to be able to refer to a range of theories and critical interpretations of these stories from the Bloody Chamber. Therefore, I'll ask you to pause the video and just take a moment to remind yourself of what critic Marina Warner said about Angela Carter's tales, which we used in the last lesson to understand the Bloody Chamber short story. And then remind yourself as well, what did Angela Carter herself say about passivity in women? Looking at this quote at the top of your screen, "Who can say what I deserve or know?" I said, "I've done nothing, but that may be sufficient reason for condemning me." This is clearly in line with what Carter says about the passivity of women. If you are passive, if you don't fight back as a female character, then that is as good as accepting your own demise and your own death. Carter clearly embodies this idea in the narrator in this interaction with Jean-Yves. But as critical students of English literature A-level, you're not just going to accept that Carter does the thing that she set out to do. We're going to evaluate that claim. And, of course, a good way to do this is to balance Carter's own view of what she was doing with what Marina Warner seems to think. So in this same interaction between the narrator and Jean-Yves, we see Jean-Yves saying, "You disobeyed him. That is sufficient reason for him to punish you." And perhaps here Jean-Yves is giving voice to the same thing that Marina Warner identified in the Marquis's characterisation, that the Marquis reveals exactly the problem with bourgeois marriage, the absolute control that the man has over the woman. And Jean-Yves, even though he might be saying it in inverted commas, kind of ironically, he's still pointing out that, yeah, in this bourgeois marriage, you, narrator, are completely under the control of the Marquis. So we find an element of what Marina Warner says in the conversation, as well as what Angela Carter herself set out to do. Carter didn't just use Adam and Eve as her prototype for the Bloody Chamber short story. She looked beyond the Bible and back to ancient mythology, where she found Pandora's box, a tale suggesting that you shouldn't be curious. Think about the connections between that and, of course, the moral of the Bluebeard fairy tale. In modern times, the phrase Pandora's box has become a bit of a cliche, and specifically to open Pandora's box. If any of you have seen the awful Pirates of the Caribbean films, feel free to write rebuttals to my email address. You'll know, of course, that Pandora's box is opened and chaos is unleashed on the world. Little bit of detail on that. Hesiod wrote the original tale, and when Prometheus stole fire from heaven, Zeus, the king of the gods, took vengeance by presenting Pandora to Prometheus' brother Epimetheus. Bit complicated, like all Greek myths. Importantly, Pandora opened a jar left in her care, and the jar contained sickness, death, and many other unspecified evils which were then released onto the world. Jar was later mistranslated into box, and that's how we get the cliche Pandora's box. First written task for the day, I want you to pause the video and summarise how Angela Carter uses inspiration from the Adam and Eve story and Pandora's box. Interesting to consider why Carter felt the need to use both a biblical allusion and a reference to Greek mythology. Now, the biblical allusion implied to us that women's culpability, women's responsibility for all the evil in the world goes back to the very first humans. I wonder if Carter is taking that idea further and saying, well, it doesn't just appear in biblical narrative, it appears in Greek narrative too, so it's not just going back in time, it's an idea that transcends cultural barriers, that is present in lots of different cultures. Now that you've made the connections broad brush between Pandora's box, Adam and Eve, and the Bloody Chamber, let's look in more detail at one particular moment where Carter really signposts that yes, she is looking at these original texts for inspiration. The narrator of the story explores this house that she's newly married into possession of, and she finds the Marquis's library. Have a look at this highlighted section from Carter's description of the library. The flames flickered along the spines inside a glass-fronted case. The imagery of the flames here clearly metaphorically implies that some kind of hellish, devilish temptation is coming the narrator's way. Eliphas Levi, the name meant nothing to me. This is because the narrator is of the modern world, or at least 19th century France, the setting of the story, and Eliphas Levi is an occult writer, very much a Gothic reference here, someone who was fascinated by the supernatural. So, for the narrator who thinks in terms of the modern world, this is not a writer's thinking that she would have considered. Then Carter lists 3 books that seem to jump out of the shelves at the narrator, including The Secret of Pandora's Box. However, where she maybe should heed the warning, be interested enough to open the book and find the warning in it, she yawns. She says there's nothing here to detain a 17-year-old girl waiting for her first embrace. So, because she is curious about what sex with the Marquis will be like, she ignores the warning that, of course, curiosity can lead to the downfall of women. It seems really important that Carter reminds us here that the narrator is a 17-year-old girl, suggesting that curiosity is entirely natural, not something that our narrator is to be blamed for. Now I'd like you to have in front of you the written work that you did from the last lesson. We're going to reflect on that and add in these new ideas from the second half of the short story to red pen redraft that piece of work. You were evaluating Marina Warner's assertion that Carter identifies the Marquis de Sade as an honest witness to the conditions of bourgeois marriage, the economics of sexual relations, and the collusion of women with their own enslavement and subjugation. Your first paragraph was arguing the point that Carter seemingly does explore the complicity of women to their own subjugation through the character of the narrator. Now, you might have chosen a range of evidence here. Of course, the story is rich with evidence to pick, but a few points I would like you to make sure you have covered. This new allusion to Pandora's box on the reference in the Marquis's library. This is a clear indication that Carter is thinking about women's curiosity being something that they are blamed for. I hope you use the idea from Carter herself that to be the object of desire is to be defined in the passive case. She seems to at once point the finger at women and say, you too often accept this passive role, and maybe also throw down the gauntlet to her contemporary feminists of the 1970s saying, no longer accept this passive role, take action instead. Finally, we would look at the narrator saying in a very sadomasochistic way that she clung to the Marquis as though only the one who had inflicted the pain could comfort me for suffering it. The paradox of her situation becomes clear, and she seems to willingly choose the Marquis's comfort, even though she recognises he was the one who gave her something to need comforting for in the first place. In your second paragraph, you made the argument that Carter suggested women's active subjugation is the fault of patriarchal structures. Yeah, they may be complicit, but it's the patriarchal structures that make them complicit, so they're not to blame. I wonder if you used Laura Mulvey's The Male Gaze from her article Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema to make an argument along these lines. One particularly objectifying image that you might have chosen from the first half of the story was, I saw him watching me in the gilded mirrors with the assessing eye of a connoisseur inspecting horse flesh, or even of a housewife in the market inspecting cuts on the slab. Laura Mulvey's Male Gaze tells us that here the male perspective of the Marquis has turned the narrator into that flesh to be consumed. Make sure you've got at least one point along those lines and build the theory into your argument. Your third paragraph should take the accusations that Carter levels at the patriarchal structures further by looking particularly at the economic underpinning of women's subjugation. Now, the evidence for this should be pretty clear. Semantic fields of wealth litter the whole story. I hope you picked up on more than one example to prove that it is a semantic field, not just one random example. And in particular, how could you resist talking about that wonderful quotation about the Marquis's wedding gift to the narrator? Make sure that you have included that close analysis that we did in the last lesson. Return to that video if you need to add that in. Then this might seem like the hardest argument, or the hardest part of your argument to make. But in your fourth paragraph, you're suggesting that the narrator's relationship with the Marquis ultimately liberates her. Loads of different ways you can argue this. One way that I thought you could pursue this argument, in the second half of the tale we see that the narrator recognises the system of oppression that she's been forced into. She says, I only did what he knew I would. By recognising the system, that's her first step, of course, to escaping it. Interesting also to consider the role of this beta male, Jean-Yves. When I thought of courage, I thought of my mother, then I saw a muscle in my lover's face quiver. It seems that the point Carter leaves us on is that women are ultimately stronger than men, even the compassionate ones. So with women being stronger than men, that is the liberation of women at the end of the tale. So I'd now like you to take those notes, those additional ideas, and to do a full red pen redraft or red font redraft of that written task from last lesson. You're then going to submit that via MS Teams. Next lesson we will be looking at The Tiger's Bride and the Courtship of Mr. Lion, the Beauty and the Beast inspired tales from the Bloody Chamber collection. You'll need to have read both of those tales in preparation for our next lesson, so by all means get a head start on that this week. If you've got any questions, contact me on MS Teams or via email as usual. I hope you're all coping with the lockdown okay, stay safe, and I will see you next time.